Forward TV. The world is thinking.
So good evening, and thank you for joining us. We're at capacity. If anybody has any second thoughts, now's the time to go. But no, thank you all for turning up tonight. Welcome to the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Science and the Arts is a series of programs that bring science to the public through the literary, visual, and performing arts. Brian Schwartz, Vice President for Research at the Graduate Center, is the director. I'm Adrienne Klein, and I'm the co-director. The postcard we distributed lists our website, the source of information for our upcoming programs. A podcast and video from this event will be available on the web in the coming weeks. Please check our website for links to these resources. Tonight's event is presented in partnership with Science and the City at the New York Academy of Sciences. Following the event, our speaker's new book will be for sale in the lobby, and he will sign copies. David Ewing Duncan is an award-winning author of 7 books and a television and radio correspondent. At the University of California at Berkeley, he is the director of the Center for Life Science Policy and a visiting researcher at the Graduate School of Journalism. He is a chief correspondent for National Public Radio's Biotech Nation and a commentator for NPR's Morning Edition. He is a special correspondent and producer for ABC's Nightline and 2020. Duncan also has been a correspondent for Nova's Science Now and a producer for Discovery Television. He is a contributor to National Geographic, Discover, Wired, Fortune, and MIT's Technology Review, and he was a longtime correspondent for Life magazine. In his newest book, Experimental Man, Duncan explores cutting-edge technologies in personalized medicine by submitting himself as the guinea pig. He chronicles his investigation, during which clinicians examined his genes, environment, brain, and body. As perhaps the most tested, healthy person in history, Duncan raises the question, what do we gain with all this information? Tonight's speaker, David Ewing Duncan.
Thank you, Adrienne, and thank you to the sponsors here. And I come to you from San Francisco, and it was nice to see outside as we were coming in, of course, inside, that it's getting nice out just like in San Francisco. Anyway, I am here to tell you, and we're going to get through a lot of material here, so I'm going to jump into it in just a second, but I spend a lot of time as a science writer and reporter talking to scientists who study various organisms. And it's yeast and flies and worms and us and humans. And this talk and this book is kind of getting back. It's a little reverse of all of that, because I am the organism being studied, talking to the scientists and to you. So this is from the guinea pig's point of view, what happens when a person sets out to take as many high-tech tests as possible, and as Adrienne said, a healthy person. And this is rather radical, as we'll find out. But before I get too far into this, I know it's the afternoon here, and I'm not sure if you had a cup of coffee or what when you came in here, but I'm going to make you work just for a second, if that's okay, and then I'll take over after that. I'd like to ask you some questions. Is everybody ready? Are you really ready? Yes. Okay. First of all, is anyone here, and these are voluntary, if you don't want to answer these, of course you don't have to, but has anyone here ever had a genetic test? Adrienne? Okay. Our host. Anybody? Okay. How many people would like to have a genetic test? Okay, we had sort of tentative hands, and as more went up, people felt more confident. Okay. This is the way new technologies work, folks. Maybe. Okay. How many have had an MRI brain scan? This is a brain scan. Okay. That's interesting. We're in a city that has a lot of MRIs, so that may be one reason. Now this is a little more thought-provoking here. How long would you like to live? I'm not putting any preconditions on this, you know, old and frail, healthy, whatever, but I am going to give you 3 possible answers just to frame this here. These are somewhat arbitrary. 80 being the approximate lifespan of an American today, 110 or 150. Okay, how many would like to live to be 80? Okay, about a quarter of the audience. Well, then you're already there, if you're already over 80. I talked to a group not too long ago, which was mostly senior citizens, and I had to amend this a little bit, kind of knock it up, because I think some of them were 110. So anyway, anybody here 110? Like to live to be 110? Okay, how about 150? Oh, we have optimists. I love optimists. Okay. And probably young, because you don't know what it's like to get old yet. All right, what we're talking about is something called personalized medicine, and you may have heard this term knocked around in the media, but it's essentially something that is not what's happened in the past, which is a focus on sickness, one-size-fits-all medicine. Most of the pills you take, the treatments you get, start with the fact that you're a human being, and they might factor in things like age or gender, but there's not a lot that's put in that's really you. So this is the past. The future is a focus on the healthy individual. This is on prevention and custom care, and these are pills and treatments and things that are designed for your particular genes and physiology and other factors that make you you, and that's different than someone else. And I put my little experimental man here, and so what we're looking at is the future, which is Leonardo with tights, but anyway, this is focused on me and on you, as opposed to just all of us all at once. So that's the overarching principle here. And this is a lecture series on science and the arts, and I did want to say that this is going to be pretty heavy on the science, but there was a little art in there. You saw that, right? Leonardo da Vinci? Okay. There'll be a few more, so don't worry. We'll pick up that theme here and there. So we start with genes. And most of you who read the New York Times and read newspapers and read books have heard a little bit about genes, or maybe even a lot. The Human Genome Project, we seem to, in the scientific community, have been hyper-focused on genes. But that's basically our blueprint as humans. That's like looking at the blueprint of a building and saying, oh, what a beautiful building, without looking at the building. You've also got here an experimental man project, and in us, environmental factors, the brain, and the body, which is where we put it all together. So these are the four areas I'll be coming to here in this talk. But before I did any of these tests, I visited my friendly neighborhood internist, my doctor, a healthy routine exam, the kind you're supposed to get every couple of years. And he, after the checkup, and he gave me a slightly longer checkup than managed care really allows, because we were doing this project here, but he declared me healthy. And slightly elevated cholesterol, slightly elevated blood pressure, although that possibly could have been because we actually had cameras in there from national television filming me as I was getting checked, so I might have been had a little bit of blood pressure because of that. My heart attack risk, and this will be important later when we get to some of the fancy tests, was around 4% risk in 10 years, which is really good. And I'm 51 years old, so that's a very nice prognosis. I don't have heart attack or heart disease in my family. So, you know, this is circa 2009, where we are now. This is basically what you find out when you're a healthy individual. 3 rules for this project. I was under the supervision, or at least with the knowledge of a physician for every test. I followed up on any findings, as you'll see. And the most important one, do no harm to me, which I violated twice, but we'll get to that. All right, the Experimental Man Index. This gives you some idea, and I did steal this from Harper's. Thank you very much. You know, they have the index at the beginning of the Harper's magazine, and there's a lot more in the front of the book along these lines of these statistics like this. But I worked with about 250 individuals and companies and labs all around the world. I had a bunch of blood drawn. I spent hours and hours and hours in an MRI. So those of you that really wanted to do the MRI, it's boring. The number of chemical toxins I was tested for in the environmental section was around 320. Gene markers in the millions, and gigabytes of data was somewhere around 100 or even more. And how much did all this cost? You have the bouncing dollars, which seem these days to be bouncing even higher. If you went out to take all these tests right now, it cost you probably around $150,000, and it could be as much as $350,000 when I finish getting all of my genetic tests, which is not quite done yet, and that's because getting an entire sequencing of your whole genome, all 3 billion base pairs, is still very expensive, although getting cheaper all the time. So section 1, genes. We have blood, we have spit, and we have swabs. These are the different ways that you give your DNA. There are other ways too, but these are the ways that I used. And it reminds you of the old rock group, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, but you'd have to rename it Blood, Spit, and Swabs. So lots and lots and lots of genetic tests. These are a couple of the websites that you may have read about, these online direct-to-consumer testing sites like 23andMe and Navigenics, Decode Me. They actually, you can go online, you pay several $100s, which most people think is pretty expensive, and you can get back from some genetic results. And did I say lots? Did I say lots of genes tested? And this is actually, the reason I bring up the whole lots is because I have heaps, millions of these genetic markers, and it's still difficult to actually even sort through all of this. So one thing that's going to keep personalized medicine a little bit in the future is just being able to sort through all of this intimate information about our cells. Now, I got results for about 2,600 different traits and diseases, and probably another 5,000 or so that weren't really very useful, very preliminary tests. But some of the critical ones I'm going to share with you here. And in fact, when people ask me, you know, what did you come out with? You know, what'd you get? What I say is something that I didn't expect, but of course it makes sense. I mostly came out fine. I came out either low or average. You know, being an adult that's reached the age I'm at, it's unlikely I have any major genetic disorder. We would know that, you know, or we would have known that long ago. So macular degeneration I came out at very low risk for. Asthma was average. Most cancers I was fine. And think about it for a second what this means, even for insurance, other aspects of disease, when many of us actually have lower risk than some other people. And right now, again, it's one size fits all. Everything is assuming that we have an identical risk, you know, 1 out of 1,000 or whatever it is. So this is about to change a lot of things, not just how we view disease. I'm going to home in here on a little bit of technical looking information on my heart attack gene markers, because this not only tells you a little bit about, in detail, of the kind of tests that I took, but also how kind of preliminary the results are. And what you're looking at in this particular chart is results from the 3 major online testing sites, Decode Me, Navigenics, and 23andMe. And what I've done here is, if you all go to airports, you know the terrorist threat levels. So I just use that. Red is bad. Orange is not so bad. Yellow, green is great. And then in this case, black is just average. And you can see there on that column that says risk factors, right over there, that we're all over the map. We're everywhere from red to yellow. I don't have any greens, but you know, what the heck is going on with that? Shouldn't it, if I'm being tested for a heart attack markers, shouldn't it be pretty much, you know, one risk factor, and I shouldn't be getting different results from different companies? And in fact, my risk, as determined by these 3 companies, was high, medium, and low. So you tell me what to make of that. And this is very early days, and I'm a huge proponent of this information and getting it out to people, but it does need a lot of work in terms of guidelines. Aha, you notice that. It's because it was done, that's yet another issue with these companies. They actually determine the risk in a different way, but under their own criteria, that was a medium risk. Okay, we also have genes that are sometimes called recreational, like, say, ancestry genetics, which is a lot of fun. I met last night, again, my long-lost cousin, who we were connected by an online genetic testing service, and we're both related to the same great-great-great-great-grandfather. And this, we actually found each other through genes, which was really fun. So that's recreational, and there's a lot of preliminary data as well. For instance, if you notice there, I have a substantially higher risk of heroin addiction. Never really been attracted to the stuff, but that's what this tiny little study out of Germany suggested. And in most of these studies, you need a lot of people, a big population to test, because they're comparing people who have the trait to those who don't. And just statistically, you need a lot of people. But I did have a nice result with longevity. It looks like I have higher odds of living over 100. It's assuming I'm healthy. A couple of my favorite genes. We all have our favorite genes, don't we? Caffeine fast metabolizer, and if I had a cup of coffee up here, I would just take a sip, because I can drink coffee all day long and barely feel it.
No heartburn?
What's that?
No heartburn. Heartburn.
Well, I do feel other symptoms with he asked if I have heartburn. I do have other symptoms because coffee does start giving you jitters and things like that. But the caffeine effect is very minimal with people who have this particular genetic variation. Another favorite one is risk-taking. And I have a medium to high risk. There actually is a variation that gives you an even higher risk. And I know some people like this who are truly nuts. I'm only a little nuts, but I had to be a little nuts to take the test for this book. All right, we also have the experimental family, the experimental parents, the experimental brother, and the experimental daughter. And she's 20, by the way, and she made me do this. She's a biology major. And I was a little iffy about wanting to test my daughter, my parents and brother, who cares. But this was interesting because obviously a real person like myself is in a family. You know, I'm not merely the guinea pig subject. And part of what this whole experiment was how would we all absorb and use this information. And there are a couple of traits here that give you some idea of how this information can be presented to a family. For heart attack, this is a major gene variation for risk factor for heart attack. I came out with what's GG, and that's in red because that's the highest risk in this particular, and it's not even a really high risk, but for this particular gene it's a high risk. And you can see where I got it from. Thanks, Mom and Dad. They each gave me their own Gs. Because they only carried one G each, that's a lesser risk. And this is basic genetics for you all that are geneticists. But you can see there's a combination that I could get, GG, which I got. My brother, however, lucky brother, got the low risk variation. My daughter got the medium risk. Alzheimer's was another one that people are worried about when they get tested. We don't have Alzheimer's in the family. But much to my surprise, we did come out with a medium-low risk with my brother and my father. And when I called my brother and told him this, he said, "Who's this again?" So you can tell how seriously my family takes this information, being a healthy, basically healthy family. But there is an exception to this in my family, and we have a genetic issue, and I tell this story because it is important as we're talking about this somewhat preliminary and fuzzy but interesting information that we're talking about genetic risk factors for common diseases. Now, there are very well-established tests and markers for rare genetic disorders. And in this case, my brother ended up, here are the two of us when we were very small, and we're dressed alike, and there's my mother. And we're very similar genetically, but there was one little element in there that was very different in my brother. It's actually missing, in this case, a few nucleotides within a couple of genes that have to do with making bones flexible. And my brother ended up getting a disease called osteogenesis imperfecta. And unfortunately, he's disabled at the moment, and this has been a really rough time for him. It's slowly manifested throughout his life, and he's now in his late 40s. But we were each tested for these two genes at stake there, and I came out normal, and my brother did not. And there's a story, the whole story of this is in the book Experimental Man, but this is to emphasize the fact that genetics can be very serious even as we're working through some of these preliminary tests like heroin addiction and caffeine fast metabolizing gene. Okay, some pluses. We get some insight. I don't know if you, from what you see here, if you would get insight with this information, but it was interesting, and we will get more insight as the tests get better. Personal empowerment. These particular websites I described actually give you your results directly, and they don't go through your doctor, which makes some people nervous. It's pushing society to actually embrace personalized medicine more quickly. Medicine tends to be very conservative, medical research. So I think that these tests and the availability of them is making the medical community really begin to pay more attention and make them more valid and accurate. And then it's, of course, useful for drug development. Now, a few issues. which I've gone over in part here, but just to summarize, the science is not entirely ready for some of these tests. You do need a consumer reports, and in fact, that's partly what I do in the book. I talk about and rate and describe the usefulness. And in the Center for Life Science Policy at Berkeley, we're actually have a big project right now to develop guidelines for genetic testing that tell you things like privacy, can your employer get a hold of this and use it against you, some other issues like that that are really unformed right now and need to be worked on with some urgency as this information gets out. Physicians are not always trained, although this is being worked on at least to some extent. Potential to frighten. You know, some people getting an Alzheimer's result might have been frightened if that was their particular behavioral characteristic, is to be somewhat nervous, what they call the worried well. Obviously, my family is not, but some people are. It's very expensive right now to get these tests, so that needs to go down. Insurance very seldom covers these things, but that will be changing as well. But as I said, genetics, just the beginning. We also have the environment, the brain, and the body. So this is the environment that we all love, sunset. This is what we humans, in some cases, have added to the environment. And these things that get out into the air and water and food end up sometimes inside of us. A couple years ago, I did a National Geographic story where I had myself tested for all of these chemical toxins. And this is a graphic that appeared in that story, my chemical report card. I was tested for pesticides, dioxins, PCBs, all kinds of pretty nasty chemicals. And more blood drawn, just endless amounts of blood. I don't even like getting my blood drawn, by the way. In fact, I really hate it. 320 chemicals were tested inside of me. We detected 165. And that doesn't mean the others aren't in there. They were just not detectable using today's technology. And all of these tests cost around 15 grand. But this was even a discount. It probably would have been more like twice that, actually, because it's so difficult to find these tests or these chemicals at such small levels, parts per billion, parts per trillion. They're buried deep inside the blood, and you can imagine all the chemicals that are in your blood, both natural and not so natural. So to find these and filter them out is very expensive. What I did was, for this particular part of the book, I went back into my past as sort of a chemical biography, if you will, to look and see where I may have been exposed to these chemicals. And this is my house in San Francisco. I grew up in Kansas, almost smack dab in the middle of the country. And that's a picture of the lake where I grew up. And it was a very, very wonderful place to grow up. It was very idyllic, lots of woods. We went swimming. And the Kansas River was just west of us, and in this picture above the lake. And just outside of this picture is a major Superfund site. So I grew up within a mile of a toxic waste dump that cost hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money to clean up. And we actually played in this dump when I was a kid. So imagine being a journalist asked to write a story about this and finding out, oh my God, I lived, not only was I exposed to these toxins, but there they were. And in fact, when you read the report, it has pesticides, it has all of these different chemicals listed page after page after page, which then showed up in me later on. Maybe got them somewhere else, but this seems like a likely culprit. Pesticides, there are a number of them that came up in me in traceable levels, but DDT, or actually the metabolite it breaks down into, called DDE, is the big blue column there. That's my level. The yellow column is the 95th percentile of the national testing for this, and that's basically the highest levels that were found, except for the ones off the chart. So as you can see, this was a chemical, DDT, I was exposed to as a child because I grew up when they were still spraying it before DDT was banned. And even all these years later, I still have a huge amount of this in me compared to other Americans. But the interesting thing is that this has a half-life, this chemical, of about 15 or 18 years, which means it halves as it leaves your body. And so I would have had about 3 times this level when I was a child. And when I was a kid, by the way, we would take our bicycles. Every year they would bring a big truck and spray DDT out at our lake because it would get rid of mosquitoes that might have malaria. And we would ride around in the back in the cloud with our bikes going through the cloud. And I wish I had a picture of that. There was one when I was a kid because my mother got very upset. Anyway, The other, one of the other tests I took was for flame retardants. And these are chemicals, unlike many of the pollutants I'm describing here, that we actually like, because flame retardants keep things from burning. They retard flames. And we, in fact, need these if a building's on fire, if a plane is burning, something like that. And these flame retardants are all over this room. They're in your clothes, they're in my computer, anything plastic, anything with textiles. They are everywhere, and actually they are by law. And curiously enough, the major flame retardant that's been used for the last 30 years is in a family of chemicals called bromide flame retardants. And it turns out that these bromide flame retardants, at least in animals, have caused thyroid disruption. They're a suspected cancer-causing agent. So these things turned out to not be such a great idea. Again, we have very tiny quantities in us, but they do appear in humans. And in fact, in me, I have 12 times the average. I mean, I'm way beyond even people who work in the factories that make these. And this was quite a surprise, because I don't live anywhere near a flame retardant factory, and I don't have any particular exposure in my house any more than anyone else. And so I called the world expert on this. His name is Aki Bergman. He lives in Sweden. And I was in an airport, and he said, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "Well, I could be." So I sat down. And he goes, "You have very high levels of flame retardant. It's very dangerous. It's very bad." And so once he settled down and I settled down, he tried to figure out where these might have come from. And he said, "Did you buy a new mattress? Because, you know, new things that are new that have had the chemicals recently added to them tend to have a little higher levels. Did I have a new computer or some other appliance like a television with this plastic, and when it heats up, it actually lets off a little bit of gas of this bromide flame retardant?" No, no, and no. None of that. And then finally, I suggested, "Well, what about airplanes? They must have a lot of this stuff in them." And he goes, "Yes, yes, that could be it." And he said, in fact, that he was about to launch a study about airplanes. And I do fly an extraordinary amount, way too much, about 200,000 or 300,000 miles a year. And obviously, planes, again, we want them to not burn if they crash, and we have time to get out. And so these are good things. They save lives. But if they end up inside of me. So what do I make of that? You can light me on fire and I won't burn. So the airplane theory. After the National Geographic story, I kept in contact with Aki, and he ended up doing this study. And it turns out that the airplane theory might have some validity. It needs a lot more research, but these little columns here are showing the after results of a bunch of people that he sent off on airplanes to fly on long flights, and he tested their blood before and after for these flame retardant levels, and it turns out that they spiked way up after the flight. And in fact, as they measured the air quality in the airplanes, it got more and more. And before you all get panicked and never fly again, this is still tiny little amounts. And even Aki, who told me to sit down and made it sound like I was about to die, said that these are still not anywhere close to levels that would probably harm me. But the issue here really is that we don't know. One final chemical I'm going to tell you about is mercury. And I did a little experiment. This is one where I actually did potentially harm myself, hopefully not too badly. I did something called a fish gorge, and I did this twice. So stupidly enough, I did it once, and even stupider, I did it twice. So this is where I went off the coast of California, and the book starts with me catching a halibut. I'm actually out on a fishing boat catching this fish. And I went home and I ate it for lunch. And I bought a swordfish, which I ate for dinner. And these are two rather large predator fish, and the swordfish being larger. And mercury, our major source of exposure of mercury as humans is eating big fish. And small fish are fine, but the big fish eat the small fish, each of which has mercury in it, so it accumulates in these big fish in fairly high quantities. So I went out and I tested, before these 2 meals, it's only 2 meals, my level. It's 4 parts per billion of mercury. And that's safely below the 5.8 parts per billion threshold that the EPA suggests that you don't go over in your blood mercury level. But after these 2 meals, you'll never guess what my level was. 13 parts per billion. So it more than doubled, and I was way above that safety threshold just from these 2 meals. And again, I don't want to scare people off from eating fish, because this is the big fish that give you the most mercury. Small fish are fine. They have very small levels of mercury, or very minute levels of mercury. But the EPA, FDA, others do suggest that women of childbearing age and small children don't eat a lot of big fish. And personally, I don't even really like fish, but I'm not eating a lot of big fish myself. I'll just leave it at that. And the main source, of course, from this is coal-burning power plants. And we in California are getting a big spike of mercury in our water and in our fish because all of the new power plants being built in Asia are actually sending clouds of this over. And I read somewhere, and I need to verify this, but something like 25% of the air in Los Angeles actually comes now from Asia. And we'll take questions at the end, if that's okay, so I can get through this. What can we do? We can stop breathing, stop eating. We can stop using all of these wonderful tools of technology that use these chemicals. We can go for more research, which of course we need. We can ban these chemicals, and we've done that. Although one would hope in the future that we start actually investigating the chemicals before they get toxic and then have to ban them later. You know, find out what's going on first, which has in fact become the law in Europe. There's new legislation there in the EU Parliament that requires chemicals to be tested for toxicity before you release them into the environment, which seems to make sense to me. We can develop safer chemicals. This is a big part of the green movement, and it's very exciting. There's a lot going on in California and other places trying to develop safer substitutes for chemicals like flame retardants. We can also do something to learn at least how each of us are situated to be able to deal with these chemicals. And so we can integrate this with genetics. And one of the more exciting things that I did in the Experimental Man Project, and I wasn't sure that I'd be able to do this, but trying to link up genetics with the environmental factors. And this is a little peek into the future, personalized medicine, and hopefully it will be coming soon. It's an integration of the genetic variations and the environmental risk factors. And I've talked about chemicals here, but under the sort of dome of environmental factors here are also UV rays, stress, pretty much anything that happens to you as an organism from the environment. And I'm calling this Enviro Genomics, and as the writer I should probably come up with a far more creative term, but this is the fusion of the environment and genomics. And when I was talking about that blueprint earlier, this is where we start seeing what the building looks like, because it's when these genetic factors are influenced by the environment. That's really what makes us us, and also gives us certain defenses or not from these environmental factors. I did a couple of simple tests, and since we're on the mercury theme, what I did was I went out and I found that there were 13 genetic variations that have been found in studies, and this is very, very preliminary data. I was able, with my genetic data, to find a number of them, my variations. And what this means is that we each are born with a particular genetic defense mechanisms that evolution has given us. You know, if you think about it, as an organism, what we have to be prepared for is the onslaught of the environment. You know, everything from sunlight to oxygen, everything. And we've developed certain defenses, and that is embedded in our genes. I came out in my little test here fine on this, but in fact, if I had had different variations, it could have suggested that I'm more sensitive to the ravages of mercury in this case. And in one of these cases, actually several of these genes control a chemical called glutathione in cells, which flushes out mercury. And mercury usually is flushed out within about 30 days of exposure, but some people retain it a lot longer, and especially in their brain, and that's what can cause some damage. And I suspect that we're going to find in the next few years that a lot of these mysterious diseases that affect some people but not others have a genetic component like this that's been triggered by the environment. So issues for the environment, very little data on these trace chemicals, as I suggested. Much more research is needed. Also, very little data on the gene-environment interaction part of this. And you've got your geneticists over here, you've got your toxicologists over here, and these guys haven't done a lot of communicating until fairly recently. But there are some sort of exciting projects. The NIH, National Institutes of Health, has a new gene-environment interaction, and I think that with the initiative, when the stimulus money that's been just approved by Congress kicks in, there seem to be a number of these projects on the gene-environment initiative and interaction field that I think are going to get some good funding. And I think this is something that needs to be worked on quickly, especially as levels of some of these chemicals continue to increase in the environment. So, part 3. The brain. This is a movie of my brain. And every time I look at it, I get a little, chill go through. And I don't know if you feel that way because it's not your brain, but it's pretty weird to be looking at a movie of my brain. My kids all went, ew, when they saw that. So these are the various tests I got, fMRI, various MRI scans. I had put on this funny cap that took and basically measured the electrical signals in my brain, various other tests. The first round was called structural MRI, and these actually look at the size of the anatomical features inside your brain, so the various parts of your brain. They're looking for things like, is there evidence of disease? And this is my brain, which is actually, believe it or not, fairly healthy. In fact, some people were surprised it was even there. On the right is an anonymous person's brain that has advanced Alzheimer's, and the pixels are a little fuzzy there, but you can see that there's quite a big difference. And in fact, this is one way to detect quite early Alzheimer's. It's too expensive to use routinely. We're talking about $1,000 per test. But as these tests get cheaper, perhaps this could be a very useful way, not only Alzheimer's, but a lot of other diseases. I was tested for functional MRI, and what these tests measure is behavioral traits by looking at the blood flow in your brain, which has iron. The blood has iron in it, and it can be picked up by the fMRI. And it's a rather crude measurement, but it can actually tell you which parts of your brain are reacting to what stimuli. So in this case, I was tested for fear and anxiety. And I was shown a picture of a growling lion. So you got to imagine me, I'm in this machine, and there's a little monitor over my head here, and they're showing me various pictures. And they flash a picture of a growling lion so fast I don't see it, it's subliminal. But my brain sees it. And the back of the brain there, which is mostly lit up in yellow, is the fight or flight, the emotional part of your brain. It basically completely goes bonkers because it's seeing a lion. And I don't even know why, because I haven't seen the actual lion. But they immediately flash on a picture of a sunset. So the front of your brain kicks in, the rational part of your brain, and says, chill out, it's okay, it's a sunset. And you can actually see that. If I had a series of images here, you can see that communication going on in the brain. And this may seem, maybe not particularly interesting to you all, but it's fascinating to understand as you get more of these scans that there's a conversation going on in your brain. And it's partly to do with the older parts of your brain, like the emotional parts, talking to the newer parts, which are the rational and not so emotional parts of the brain. You obviously have the really old parts that have to do with things like fear and hunger, and basic emotions like that. So here's my brain trying to remember. I was tested for memory. It's amazing that I do remember. In fact, memory is a remarkable thing. I was tested compared to a younger group and an older group, and being in the middle of them, I not surprisingly came out about in the middle in my ability to remember things. But it was still normal. I mean, what they're testing here for, by the way, is I'm in the healthy test group. They're looking for people who have abnormalities, and these are physicians looking for ways to treat people. I also was tested for some rather odd tests. This is for belief in God. And this is at the National Institutes of Health, your tax dollars at work. And this is actually some serious studies on why humans believe in the first place. And the interesting thing is the researcher here studies God and also baseball. Because some fan behavior is virtually, verging on religious adjuration for certain teams. And he comes at this because he's a Cubs fan. And anybody that follows the Cubs know that they have not won a World Series for 100 years. They came close again this year, even closer last year. But he's trying to figure out why people are obsessed with a losing team, because you aren't supposed to really follow a losing team. It's not supposed to make you feel good. Anyway, so I was put in one of these MRI machines. I was given a little device. I had to answer yes or no to there is a God. And I'm not a very religious person in an organized sense. I like to think of myself as being spiritual, but I don't spend a lot of time in church, but I was raised that way. And I also, as a person that thinks scientifically, or at least hopes I do, I cannot dismiss the fact that there could be an intelligent force out there. So anyway, as I'm describing all this was going on in my brain, and it was lighting up all over the place. How do I answer this? How do I answer this? Yes, no, yes, no. And there's a picture what was going on. We had stuff all over the place. That's the frontal lobe and the back lobe. And in fact, the motor cortex, the thing that makes you actually move yourself, was being activated. And later on, they told me, boy, you must have a very active physicality of, physical belief in God, because your motor cortex is going. And I said, well, that's actually because I was trying to figure out which button to press. So I will leave it to you to read the book to find out yes or no, since I don't want to offend anybody with how I answered this. One more test was in a field called neuroeconomics, and they also call this neuromarketing. And yes, they are putting people into MRIs and showing them products and saying, which does your brain like? Not which one you like, which does your brain like? And you are asked too. They do ask your opinion. And in this case, I had a little punch box that had me rate between 1 and 8 several products. And one of them was Pan's Labyrinth, which was an art movie that came out a couple of years ago, very dark and violent movie. And I have been periodically a filmmaker and in film, and a lot of my friends are, the kind of art intellectual film types. So of course I said, I love Pan's Labyrinth because I am an intellectual. I gave it an 8. Well, it turns out that my brain outed me on this. Turns out my brain like Dodgeball, the movie. So my results were Dodgeball. I had the biggest score. Pan's Labyrinth actually was negative. And fortunately for my rather battered intellectual sensibility, Beethoven was fairly high up there, and the Kite Runner, although Dreamgirls somehow got in there. I'm not sure where that came from. I'm not a big hip-hop fan, so that was at one end of the spectrum as well. So at least my brain agreed with me on that. Now, we talked about consumer genetics, Enviro Genomics, and there already is a budding consumer neurology. And again, these are terrible terms, which we have to figure out new terms for. But you can go on the Experimental Man website, experimentalman.com, and you can actually take a test that will measure your brain age. And my brain age turned out to be 25. That's when I was sober. I didn't drank a couple glasses of wine, and it turned out to be 37. But these are really small glasses. If I had real glasses, I probably would have been about 80 or 90. But they have used these tests. They're actually used by clinicians who are testing new drugs for Alzheimer's and other diseases of the brain. And they can see if the drug is working and improving cognition and memory by people taking these tests before and after they've taken the drug. But the test you could take on my website is a short version of this. And it's kind of fun. And you can test it yourself. Try drinking a glass of wine after you take it once. It's free. You can take as many times as you want. So in the future, we keep talking about the future, but it's almost there. We're probably talking about Enviro Genomics. And now we're really getting into tongue twister territory here, but this is the linkage of all three of these factors. And I want to talk about the idea of there being a gene mutation you're born with. So let's see, I think I put a particular gene in here. Yes, the BDNF gene is a gene that when it's normal, you have a normally functioning brain. If you have certain genetic variations, you can have some neural impairments of various sorts. And so what happens here is you could be tested for the gene mutation. Let's say you have that, you have a risk factor for the neural impairment. It's obsessive compulsive disorder, anorexia, and some other disorders like that that you get, or at least are linked to this gene mutation. It also, this particular gene can be impacted by mercury. It can actually change how the gene works in the body if you expose it to high levels of mercury. And you can also detect some of this impairment with brain scans. So you could combine all three of these factors I've talked about here. And I think at some point that will happen. And I, of course, tested myself as usual. And I fortunately came out fine for this one. Our final chapter, 4, is the body. Now, what can a healthy experimental man or woman, we're all in this room, experimental men, women, children, what can you learn about your future with all of this? At the end of the day, what the heck did I learn? And we're going to talk about an example, which is heart attack, and I mentioned that earlier. It's a recipe. Basically, when you're factoring all of these different tests together that I've had, it's almost like baking a cake. You put in genomics. You add that first. This is the gene that I showed you with the experimental family with a high risk for heart attack, which I have the high risk for. You then add some biomarkers, and this is tests that many of you probably have had, like a cholesterol test. It's very sophisticated versions of these tests, but these are long-established chemistry tests that a doctor takes when he's looking into whether you're healthy or your heart is healthy or not. So we had a little bit of that, a little speck of that. Ultrasound and a CT scan of my heart. So that was done. Those came out pretty well. We combine them, we stir gently, and we come up with a list of all of these different risk factors, which are then dropped into something we call the Intelos project. And this is a company called Intelos that's based in South San Francisco that's actually developing a product which is going to be for sale in a year or two that combines all of those factors. And these are for somebody possibly like me who's of a certain age that has, a very mild, elevation of cholesterol. It kind of depends on whether someone would want to pay for this test or not, whether I would be tested. But someone who had maybe a little higher risk factors, higher cholesterol or something, this might be a useful test for them. So they put together a fancy algorithm, all these computer programs. I have no idea what's going on here, but you can tell it's a lot going on. And outspits a prediction of my future. End of the day, this is the chart that they show me. And the yellow line suggests my risk of heart attack for the next 20 years if I gain 1 pound a year. And that's the average weight gain for a man over 40 in America. And by the way, my risk factor there, if you remember at the very beginning of the talk, it was around 4% when they did a standard test on me. That's in 10 years. Here it's more like about 35, 38% in 10 years. And then it spikes way the heck up to 70% risk factor in 20 years, which is very high. And this is partly based on that gene. And it was added into this large, swirl of things that they're testing. And that had a big impact on this. But the interesting thing here is this is something I can actually do about, because that green line at the very bottom there is what happens if I don't gain any weight. So it almost zeroes out. So, no more burgers for me. Not really going to happen. I love burgers, but I am eating fewer fatty foods. And when I found this, most of these tests had little or no impact on me. I feel healthy. I needed something that I really believed and a result that I believed in before I would make any change. And I did. I actually believed this, and so I changed my diet around thanks to my friendly neighborhood nutritionist. And I dropped about 10 or 12 pounds, and I'm going to stay down, hopefully, in that green line, and I don't know how long I'll live. Looked like I was never going to have a heart attack. All right. Finally, last chapter of the book. Forget everything you've seen so far. Okay? Just block it out. Because I have a super enzyme for longevity called SEER-T1. And you all may have read about a substance called resveratrol that's in red wine. So this is the enzyme that red wine acts on to do all kinds of wonderful things. And that's actually what it looks like. Little ribbons and swirly things. And this is a conception of what it looks like. Obviously, you don't have a real picture of something that's microscopic, but that's the enzyme. And they took a test of my level of this, and this is the one I love the most, even more than the caffeine metabolizer, because I came out 1,000 times higher in my expression of this gene. So I have 1,000 times more of these little critters running around inside of my body than the average person. And it may explain my family lives a long time. It may explain why some people live longer or some families live longer because of the gene that creates this enzyme. Unfortunately, there's a little catch here. And the catch is that you have to activate this enzyme. So imagine that. You found the fountain of youth, but you need to add, like, I don't know, Kool-Aid or something to make it work. And in this case, there are two known factors to activate this enzyme. One is caloric restriction, which is basically starving yourself. And that comes from, in an evolutionary sense, organisms at times get stressed. And one of the stresses they have is that they don't have enough food to eat. And this system is found in organisms as simple as yeast and mice and worms. And what it's there for is when an organism is stressed, basically this enzyme kicks in and it creates all kinds of wonderful things in the cell. It's an antioxidant. It repairs the mitochondria, which produces the energy in the cell. It makes the cell membranes really strong. And so this is designed to keep the organism alive and functioning by slowing the process of aging. And therefore, hopefully, it's long enough to get through this stressful period of no food. And the object of all organisms is to reproduce. So you want to keep the organism alive during a time of privation. The other way is resveratrol with red wine. And this was all over the papers 2 or 3 years ago. Unfortunately, though, you can't just drink 1 or 2 glasses of red wine. And I wanted to pose to you, would it be 10 glasses? 50? Or 1,000 glasses of wine a day? Unfortunately, it's 1,000 glasses of wine a day. This is to get the full effect, the full activation of my super duper longevity enzyme. And I don't know about you all, but when I get to 200 or 300 glasses, I start getting a little woozy. So what's needed now? I've hinted at this all along, but we need an increased effort and funding, I think, right away, especially as we're throwing around all kinds of money that we're borrowing anyway. We might as well use some of it to make us healthy and push us into, I think, what should be sooner rather than later, the age of personalized medicine and predictive medicine. We need to shift our way of thinking from the current one-size-fits-all medicine. Doctor, she got the pill, so I should too. It may be that she has a very different genetic profile and physiology than you do. And we need to start thinking that way. We need to truly integrate genes in the environment with healthcare. And we need, as I mentioned much earlier, guidelines and standardization and privacy laws and other policy aspects of this. So we at the Center for Life Science Policy have developed a wonderful website, which I encourage you all to look at, the Experimental Man Project. And we're putting up stuff every day, and we just got a huge amount of material up. And this has all of my raw results as well as interpretations of the results. It's got a lot of information about personalized medicine. That's where you can take the brain tests there, the age test, if you want to do that before and after the glass of red wine, which will help extend your lifespan if you drink 100 or so. It's got a blog and lots of other fun stuff. And then here's the book. Now, once again, questions. How many people here would like to take a genetic test after hearing this? Whoa, about the same amount. Okay. How about a brain scan? Did I mention it was boring? Environmental toxicity profile. Ooh, see, you guys are risk takers here. Okay, you probably have that risk-taking gene. I'll end with a quote from Robert Frost, one of my favorite poets. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all of the difference. My questions for you are, which road will you take? And which road will we take as a society? Way too many people to mention to thank. And for more information, as I suggested, I encourage you all to go to the website, and I would love to take a few questions here. So thank you very much. Got time, I think, for a couple questions. Yes?
My question was just how much fish do you think you ate in that big fish eating day?
The question was, how much fish did I eat? I ate more than I wanted to, because as I said, I don't. I don't really know what the poundage was. You know, they were what a normal helping would be. I did test the levels of mercury in them. I actually sent them to a lab and verified that they did have fairly high levels. But it was what a normal meal would be. And I cooked them. One of them had lemons, and they were very nicely cooked, trying to actually mask the taste of the fish, which I don't like.
But wasn't the scourge in the sense of...
Oh, no, I didn't sit in. No, when I say fish gorge, it was just 2 normal meals of fish. Other questions? Yes.
Just back on that as a detail, if your reading became 13.9 parts per billion, what were the fish readings?
Well, the fish have, I would have to look that up again, but what I was doing was comparing them with a chart that the FDA several years ago tested dozens of species of fish, and actually in different places, including near where I got these fish, both from the Pacific Ocean. That's what I was really comparing it to. And they were actually quite a bit higher than those levels taken in the 90s. And that correlates with some of this preliminary data that suggests that these levels of mercury are actually going up in the Pacific Ocean, partly because of the effluents coming over from Asia. So I don't know the exact levels, but they certainly, I just wanted to make sure that they had some in there, and that that's where I was getting it for this experiment. Yeah, in the back?
Yeah, you mentioned the caloric restricted diet. Just how many calories did they want you to live on? And did it matter what those calories contained?
The question was, for a caloric restriction diet, how many calories can you get away with? And it's about a half to a third, if I remember correctly, but don't quote me on this. There are several websites. In fact, there's a caloric restriction group. If you Google caloric restriction, and it'll probably pop up as one of the top hits there. And they have a lot of information on this. There are people that are experimenting with themselves on this to see if it actually, by starving themselves, they can extend lifespan. I don't recommend this to people. There are ways to do it where you can keep the proper number or the minimal number of nutrients that you need. So it's not particularly dangerous, but I got to believe it's not real comfortable to be starving every day. It's probably not the way to go if you want to extend lifespan. Yes?
There are certain cultures that go on fasts. So if you go on fast, that helps your body to heal. And it probably triggers the stream while you're on a fast for 5 or 7 days with only distilled water. You really feel good. Your body feels good. Your mind feels clear. I did it. They do it in India.
Well, this
They do it twice a year.
Yeah, like it was a comment about the fact that some cultures and some people go through fasts, and it seems to cleanse them and make them feel better. That could very well be a small, instance of this process being kicked in. I mean, you're not going to get a big effect of this unless you do it for a really long time, but it could be. I mean, there are a lot of beneficial effects apparently to brief fasts. They may do it in Scientology. They do a lot of things in Scientology. One more question, maybe? Yes?
How do they measure the effects of stress? Because it comes and goes.
You can measure in different ways. In fact, one of the scarier measurements is that your brain apparently shrinks if you have too much stress over too long a period of time. Heavy drinking also shrinks your brain, although then again, aging shrinks your brain. And in that index at the beginning of the book, there is one line that says the status of the author's brain. That's me, the author, shrinking. Because after around 35, 40 years old, your brain does start slowly shrinking. So I don't know. When people say, how am I doing? I usually say, I'm going to die someday. And these tests verified that.
And we can continue the conversation informally, perhaps?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to stay and answer questions.
Welcome you also to purchase a book, and David would be happy to sign it for you.
Thanks again for coming.